Let's bring in Fox News Sunday anchor Shannon Bream to talk about all of this and all the news this morning. And Shannon, we're at a situation where the war in Israel is now one of our top stories again. And now we're dealing with Joe Biden, who is a lame duck president, and everybody's going to be looking to see how Kamala Harris responds to this.
Yeah, and I think people always feel a sense of worry or of heightened concern during a time of transition. And now that we know that President Biden is going to be a lame duck president, he's got 6 months left. He's got a very ambitious slate of things he wants to get accomplished. A lot of that has to do with the Middle East. But in talking to friends who live in that region, they are very worried that if Hezbollah, that goes into a full-fledged conflict, it is much more, existential. It is a much better equipped opponent for Israel than even the tragedy of what's going on in Gaza. So there is great concern. You see Secretary Blinken out there saying we don't need this to escalate. But it's a very real issue. And you have to wonder if people, our enemies, look around and see and feel a time of weakness here in the U.S.
So obviously this is going to be playing loom large in the campaign. We've just got 100 days left. And already we're starting to hear President Trump kind of refine his attacks on Kamala Harris. Listen to this.
Every voter in Minnesota needs to know that when the violent mobs of anarchists and looters and Marxists came to burn down Minneapolis 4 years ago, remember me? I couldn't get your governor to act. He's supposed to call in the National Guard or the Army, and he didn't do it. I couldn't get your governor. So I sent in the National Guard to save Minneapolis while Kamala Harris sided with the arsonist and rioter and raised money to bail out the criminals, bail them all out of jail. Ultra-liberal Kamala Harris will deliver crime, chaos, mayhem, and death to our country. I will restore law and order, justice in America.
So Kamala Harris might try to run as a law and order candidate, but it doesn't sound like former President Trump's going to let her do that quietly.
Yeah, it sounds like this is where they're really going to clash. She's going to say, as she has been saying, I'm a former prosecutor. He's a convicted felon. He's going to say she's really progressive when it came down to the situation in Minneapolis. That posting on X, then known as Twitter, by the vice president at the time is still there, urging people to vote to this Minnesota Freedom Fund, which was bailing people out. And there were people connected to that who eventually were either convicted or pled to charges like murder and rape and other violent crimes. So that's something that she'll have to talk about. But you and I, Charlie, talked about this on The Five on Friday. She described herself as a progressive prosecutor, saying that she sees essentially two victims in a crime, the crime victim and possibly as well the accused or the suspect being a victim of the criminal justice system. So those are things that are in her own words that those two are clearly going to spar about.
Yeah. You know, Shannon, I want to ask you, we were observing earlier in the show how it feels like we have all lived about a year's worth of history in the last month. And one thing that strikes me is your guest on Fox News Sunday coming up is Pete Buttigieg. He and a number of other people out there in the Democratic Party, mainstream folks within that world, they have been trying to talk about Trump maybe renegotiating the possible debate situation against Kamala Harris. He has a brand new opponent, after all, in this race. And they're coming after Trump, calling him weak and a coward and afraid and things like that. He was shot 2 weeks ago, Shannon, and they're using words like weak and cowardly to describe him that way, almost as if they've completely moved on and forgotten what happened in Pennsylvania.
Cannot believe that was 2 weeks and 1 day ago. And that iconic photo that we saw so much in the first 3 or 4 days after that shooting, it's been memory hold, I think, by a lot of people because it telegraphs something different than weakness for a lot of folks when they see that image. Others, have referred to it, oh, it's propaganda. It's a moment in history. I mean, it's a picture. And the fact is that President Trump earlier this week said, yeah, I'm going to debate her. I mean, you owe that to the American people. And I think they do. This is a different matchup. They both need to come explain where they are on any number of issues, foreign policy and crime and domestic and inflation and all of those things. So it sounds like, and the Trump campaign keeps saying, yes, he's going to do it. He wants the dust to settle with Democrats. She's got to be officially the nominee. So I think that they're very much going to show up, and I'm going to be popping my popcorn, as I think most of America will be.
As are we all. The popcorn stocks are through the roof with all this political theater that is before our eyes these past few weeks. Okay, so during Joe Biden's Oval Office address, when he talked about not running for re-election. He said something about how in the time he has remaining in office, he wants to focus on Supreme Court reform. And now he's reportedly going to announce those Supreme Court reform plans tomorrow. What are you hearing about this?
So what we're getting a glimpse of is potentially proposing term limits, an enforceable ethics code with some outside body overseeing the Supreme Court. And listen, this is a shift for him because remember, even in the last couple of years, he said, no, I don't think you should add seats or do any of these, radical things that are being called for. Now, whether he'll call for seat adding, I don't think so in what we know of the proposal so far. But they are going to be changes potentially to the court. Here's the thing. We all know with the current House and Senate, those things aren't going to get passed. So essentially what this sounds like is something to give another issue to the campaign trail. And we'll see what the vice president does if she endorses these tomorrow, too, because it'll give them something, hopefully, I think, for them to drive out their base.
But it is still pretty remarkable considering this is a guy who spent 50 years as kind of an institutionalist in the Senate, on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then suddenly he gets into a pinch and he wants to throw out the Supreme Court. Kind of amazing.
Well, maybe he now has decided that term limits and aging and those questions are important ones to consider.
Yeah, exactly. Now that he's been shown the door.